Well, I'm a professor now, but I wasn't always a professor, so I really came to international law through practice. I was practicing in the foreign ministry, and in that as a legal advisor, and mostly engaged in affairs having to do with the United Nations and associated organizations. So mainstream international law. I've also been working for the Asian Development Bank in its administrative tribunal, been a member of the International Law Commission, pleaded a couple of times in the International Court of Justice, and sat in numerous conferences, getting bored in those, but sometimes also with some agenda, proposing something, opposing something, etc. Basic international law work. And now I'm a professor, and professors write articles and thick books. Well, that would really require someone else. So I don't like everybody. I don't think myself as specific. I think of myself as really doing the general thing and occupying the whole of the field. I've written on a really large number of subjects, and I continue to work on most aspects of international law. But of course, it's true that I come from critical legal studies background, so my background is in a left-oriented criticism of international law. It's an approach that doesn't necessarily accept that everything about international law is great. And what perhaps I'm known of is this idea that law, including international law, is above all a language. And that when we learn international law, what we learn is a language. It's a linguistic competence. So when we go to law school, it's a particular way of speaking, a particular choice of words that we form paragraphs. That's what we learn. And that language has the point of trying to persuade authoritative institutions, typically courts, sometimes meetings, parliamentarians, journalists, and of course for doctoral students, the point is to persuade the jury that they can be handed the doctorate. So law for me is a language. It's a language of persuasion. It's a language which, like every language, has a specific grammar. And if I'm known for something, I'm known as somebody who has worked on the question, what is the grammar of international law? Yes, the urge for science has been there often. I rather think in the universities, international law comes to us in two forms. One is the craftsmanship of law, which is the craftsmanship of producing sentences that are competent legal sentences, that end up in normative propositions such as this is valid law, or that this is how the law should be interpreted, or that this would be an effective implementation of the law. These would be the kinds of statements that professional lawyers are called upon to produce as part of the craftsmanship of law. There is nothing specifically scientific about that. But law faculties are not just about craftsmanship. They are also about intellectual exercises. They are also about thinking about how society works, what kinds of jobs lawyers take upon themselves, what kinds of interests law and lawyers represent, what kinds of projects law carries and lawyers are with them. Law is a fantastic toolbox for understanding society, for examining society, for operating in society. In that regard, one can say that there's a justifiable scientific urge in trying to understand how through these legal concepts, how through this legal craftsmanship, we rule society. Law, as Duncan Kennedy has famously written, legal education is training for hierarchy. So the men and women who go through law schools become men and women of authority. They are in high hierarchical positions in society and usually have a decent wage, sometimes are really very well off, and they are in a privileged position. When we as lawyers occupy those positions, we of course have a responsibility for society, and that responsibility must be analyzed, how we use it, what opportunities are available to us. In that, universities and the law faculty plays a big role. It looks at what it is that lawyers do, how they could do their work better, how they could do their work in particular so that the immensely unjust society that we have could be made slightly more just. Yes, I'm not that keen on the word science. And also my experience of students is that, well, maybe it's different in France, but that they are not that keen on being scientists. In English, to use the word science of law is slightly awkward. People don't do that. In German, the word Wissenschaft enters more easily in that description. I think most students, when they come to law school, have a very obscure sense of what it is to be a lawyer and what it is that they gain from there. As I said, I don't think most of them think that this is training for science. I think they think that this is training in a craftsmanship, as I said earlier, training in how to become a practitioner that takes upon cases, other people's cases, to courts, to other authoritative bodies, etc. And they want to learn that craft. And it's only some of these students at some point of their studies when they start to think about the craft itself from outside. So what is this craft a craft of? What is the role of law and lawyers in society? And at that point, for that little group of students, the issue of whether all this can be recognized as something that can be scientifically studied emerges. Otherwise, I don't think the word science really applies very much. But I'm really surprised that when first-year law students come to law school, the question of what the competence is that they learn when they enter the law school is not raised. And for me, it's so obvious. It is a linguistic competence. They learn to speak in a certain way. They learn to use certain professional expressions, complex expressions in particular ways that then about the midterm of the first year, they recognize that, well, now we are able to use these expressions, and when their friends from school meet up with them, they often use those expressions to show that, well, I am now in the way of attaining this specific professional competence that will make me different from what you are, who have taken these other professional specializations or haven't gone to the university perhaps. And their friends have an ambivalent attitude towards that. Among each other they say, oh, he's become so important or self-important and he's become such a lawyer now. So it's a matter of speaking, it's a way of using complex expressions, also becomes a habitus later on. So when you leave the law school, you find it easy to dress in a certain way, you have a tie and then you put a robe on. All of this paraphernalia that comes with the law as well. All of this underlines the fact that law is about performing. It's about performing in a literary way. It's also performing in front of audiences. It's performing as habitus as well. To be a lawyer is to have chosen a specific performance in society. Unfortunately, I don't have a theory of any kind, and it's really hard to classify myself. Also for me, I'm sure, of course, there are people out there who are constantly classifying and saying, well, Professor Koskenniemi stands for this, he stands for that proposition, he's really in this school or that school, but I don't find that very interesting or important. So the work I do is an intellectual work to try to understand law in its very many permutations. I use as tools for this what I call, borrowing from Claude Lévi-Strauss, what I call the expression bricolage. So bricolage is about using the stuff you find hanging around there in the academy, in different kinds of theories, different kinds of approaches, legal and non-legal approaches, stuff that makes otherwise hard to understand things easier to understand, that gives an expression to something that people haven't been able to give an expression to make some complex things seem not so complex, to enable lawyers, my colleagues, people with whom I collaborate to make them more efficient in what it is that they work. Bricolage. So I don't stand for a theory. I haven't seen a theory from which consequences could be deduced so that one could just sit aside and let the theory machine produce whatever the theory is. No, it's a human activity. I think all academic activity is like this, by the way. Of course, some people feel more comfortable in being classified in some ways than other people. But I think all of us just try to use whatever we find and to make the best of it and to try to persuade our own audiences, academic audiences, our colleagues. We write articles to persuade the readers of those journals and think books in order to persuade larger groups of people that we have been able to grasp something that others haven't. And I constantly question myself. Like any other person, I am a bundle of contradictions. And the world is a really difficult place to understand, and it's a contradictory place. And we try to make the best of it. It's very fuzzy, it's slippery, it's fluid. To seize it, one needs to be able to live with the fact that one hasn't got a full explanation of everything, and that many of the explanations we give tend to be in tension with each other, if not contradictory to each other. This is how life is. And of course there is a virtue in an effort to bring about coherence. But I don't think one should be overly concerned if one is unable to create that coherence immediately. And in any case, the coherence that you created yesterday will tomorrow be just a bundle of false assumptions and contradictions in itself. So one thing around this broad theme that I would want to say is that don't commit to international law. Don't think that international law, human rights law, environmental law, humanitarian law, investment law, trade law would have already solved the world's problems. No, so you have to solve those problems. These are just tools that you use, and like any tools, you have to be very careful which tools do you use. And often what happens is that you learn to use some tool, and you think that the world's problems have to do with that tool, when actually you need completely different kinds of tools. Lawyers, especially international lawyers, believe that international law is a good thing, and that when you commit to international law, then you've already done something important, and that the world is going to be a better place. So that is an illusion that I have to break, and that people have to be critical of. International law is a language, like the Finnish language or the French language. It's true that we must use language to solve our problems, but the language itself hasn't solved those problems. A commitment to speaking French or being a professional international lawyer is just a first step. And then you use that language and that law in order to solve problems. And that's hard, and you have to be clever about how to solve it. You have to see clearly what there is as a problem and ask yourself, why do these things come to us as problems and not those things?